In 1368, China entered one of the most famous chapters in its imperial history, the Ming Dynasty. It began after the collapse of the Yuan dynasty, the Mongol-led regime founded by Kublai Khan's successors. For many Chinese subjects, the Ming represented more than a change of rulers. It was a restoration of Han Chinese imperial rule after nearly a century under a foreign conquest dynasty. The new dynasty called itself the Great Ming, meaning the Great Brightness, and it would rule China for almost 3 centuries, from 1368 to 1644. During that time, it built monuments, commanded enormous armies, sponsored ocean voyages, expanded trade, and presided over a population that may have reached between 160 and 200 million people. But the Ming story is not simply one of strength. It is also a story about rigid systems, hidden weaknesses, economic dependency, climate pressure, and the dangers of a state that looked powerful while its foundations were quietly cracking. The founder of the Ming dynasty was the Hongwu emperor, a man whose rise was extraordinary. Born into poverty, he lived through famine, social collapse, and the chaos of rebellion before becoming the ruler of China. That background shaped the way he governed. Hongwu wanted order above almost everything else. He imagined an empire of self-sufficient rural communities, where peasants farmed, soldiers served, officials obeyed, and everyone remained in a fixed place within society. His goal was not a flexible commercial empire, but a stable agrarian state that could survive without being disrupted by ambitious nobles, corrupt ministers, or uncontrolled markets. He built a massive standing army, reportedly exceeding 1 million troops, and tried to ensure that military families would produce soldiers generation after generation. In Hongwu's mind, stability came from discipline. But the same rigidity that made his system feel secure also made it difficult to adapt when China changed. Hongwu was deeply suspicious of concentrated power. He weakened court eunuchs, distrusted unrelated magnates, and tried to prevent ministers from becoming too influential. To protect the dynasty, he placed many of his sons in powerful regional positions across China, giving imperial princes military and political authority. He also issued dynastic instructions known as the Huangming Zhuxuan, meant to guide later generations and preserve his political design. But this plan had a dangerous flaw. By giving princes real power, Hongwu created rivals inside the imperial family itself. After his death, his young successor, the Zheng He emperor, tried to reduce the influence of these powerful uncles. One of them, the Prince of Yan, rebelled. This conflict, known as the Jingnan Campaign, ended in 1402 when the Prince of Yan seized the throne and became the Yongle emperor. The dynasty had survived, but its founding blueprint had already failed in a civil war. The Yongle emperor became one of the most important rulers in Ming history. He was energetic, ambitious, and determined to make his reign look legitimate after taking power by force. One of his most lasting decisions was transforming his northern power base into a major imperial center. He renamed it Beijing and eventually made it the heart of Ming authority. There he ordered the construction of the Forbidden City, a vast palace complex designed to express the emperor's separation, majesty, and control. Yongle also restored the Grand Canal, strengthening the link between China's wealthy southern grain regions and the northern capital. This mattered enormously. Beijing was politically strategic, close to the northern frontier, but it depended on food, taxes, and supplies transported from the south. The canal turned geography into governance, allowing the Ming state to feed its capital and maintain a powerful imperial presence near the steppe frontier. Yongle also restored the importance of the imperial examination system in official appointments. This system selected government officials through mastery of Confucian texts and classical learning. In theory, it rewarded education and moral discipline rather than birth alone. In practice, it created a powerful class of scholar bureaucrats who believed they were the guardians of proper government. But Yongle did not rely only on Confucian officials. He also rewarded eunuchs who had supported him and used them as a counterweight against the scholar bureaucrats. This tension between officials and eunuchs would become a recurring feature of Ming politics. Scholar officials often saw eunuchs as corrupt palace insiders. Emperors, however, sometimes trusted eunuchs precisely because they were personally dependent on the throne. The result was a court system full of rivalry, suspicion, and factional struggle, where political influence often depended on proximity to the emperor rather than formal office alone. The most famous eunuch of the Ming period was Zheng He, commander of 7 massive voyages into the Indian Ocean. These expeditions sailed as far as Arabia and the eastern coasts of Africa, using fleets that displayed Ming power on an enormous scale. They were not voyages of colonization in the later European sense. They were diplomatic, commercial, and symbolic missions designed to project imperial prestige and bring foreign rulers into a tributary relationship with China. The ships carried goods, envoys, soldiers, and the message that the Ming emperor stood at the center of a civilized world order. Yet these voyages were expensive, and after Yongle's era the appetite for such grand maritime projects faded. Later officials questioned their value, and the navy gradually declined. The retreat from naval ambition shows an important Ming pattern. Spectacular power could be mobilized when the emperor demanded it, but sustaining that power over generations was much harder. By the mid-15th century, Ming confidence suffered a major shock. In 1449, during the Tumu crisis, the Zhang emperor, also known as Emperor Yingzong, was captured during a disastrous campaign against northern enemies. For an empire built around the sacred authority of the emperor, this was more than a military defeat. It was a humiliation that exposed the limits of Ming power on the frontier. After this crisis, the dynasty became more defensive. Instead of projecting strength deep into Inner Asia, the state invested heavily in fortifications. Forced labor helped construct the Liaodong Palisade and connect sections of the Great Wall into forms closer to what many people recognize today. The Great Wall was not simply a monument. It was a sign of strategic anxiety. The Ming could still command huge resources, but it increasingly used them to manage threats rather than confidently dominate them. Inside the empire, the Ming government tried to count, classify, and tax its people. Wide-ranging censuses were conducted roughly every 10 years, but accurate records were extremely difficult to maintain. China was vast, archives were enormous, and local communities often had strong incentives to avoid official attention. Peasants who appeared in the records could be taxed or forced into labor. Some disappeared from registration. Others transferred or donated land to tax-exempt temples, powerful families, or eunuch-controlled interests. This created a dangerous imbalance. The population was growing, but the state increasingly collected revenue from a shrinking registered tax base. In other words, more people lived under Ming rule, yet fewer were visible to the fiscal machinery that funded the dynasty. This kind of problem does not always cause immediate collapse. Instead, it slowly weakens the state until a crisis arrives and the treasury cannot respond. The Ming also struggled to control its coasts. Laws known as hygiene restricted private maritime trade, partly to protect against Japanese pirates and coastal disorder. But restrictions often created the very problems they were meant to solve. When legal trade was limited, merchants, sailors, and local power brokers had incentives to smuggle. Some became pirates themselves, or cooperated with pirate networks. Because illegal trade was profitable. This shows a broader tension in Ming policy. The state wanted order, registration, and control. But China's economy was becoming more dynamic, especially along the coast. Demand for Chinese goods was rising, and maritime trade could not simply be wished away. When official policy failed to match economic reality, people found ways around it. Smuggling was not just criminality, it was also a sign that the empire's regulations were out of step with the commercial world developing around it. By the 16th century, global trade transformed the Ming economy. Europeans arrived in Asian trade networks, with the Portuguese establishing a presence near Guangzhou at Macau, followed by Spanish and Dutch commercial expansion. New crops from the Columbian exchange entered China, including maize, potatoes, and chili peppers. These crops mattered because maize and potatoes could grow in regions where traditional grains were less reliable, helping reduce famine and support population growth. Chili peppers would eventually become deeply associated with cuisines such as Sichuan food. But the biggest economic change was silver. Chinese demand for silver combined with European access to mines in the Americas, especially through Spanish and Portuguese networks. Huge amounts of South American silver flowed into China because foreigners wanted Chinese goods such as silk, porcelain, and tea. The Ming economy became increasingly monetized around silver, replacing earlier paper money that had lost trust through repeated inflation. At first, silver helped the Ming economy function. It gave merchants, taxpayers, and officials a more trusted medium of exchange. But it also created dependency. Taxes increasingly had to be paid in silver, which meant farmers needed access to silver even if they lived in a village economy based mainly on crops. When harvests were good and silver circulated, the system could work. When agricultural conditions worsened or silver became scarce, the burden became crushing. Reformers such as Zheng He tried to strengthen the state and rationalize taxation, and some reforms initially succeeded. But wider forces undermined them. The Little Ice Age brought colder weather, poor harvests, floods, and stress on agriculture. Then disruptions in imported silver supplies caused the value of silver to rise sharply. Farmers suddenly needed more produce to obtain the same tax money. A tax system that looked efficient in stable times became brutal in crisis. By the early 17th century, the Ming Dynasty faced a convergence of disasters: crop failures, floods, epidemics, fiscal weakness, military pressure, and rebellion. The state still looked grand from the outside, but its ability to pay troops, relieve suffering, and maintain order was breaking down. In 1644, rebel forces led by Li Zicheng entered Beijing, and the last Ming emperor in the capital fell. Li founded the short-lived Shun dynasty, but he could not secure China. A Ming general, Wu Sangui, defected and helped the Manchu-led 8 banner armies enter through the northern frontier. These forces defeated Li and established the Qing dynasty. Ming loyalists continued in southern China as the Southern Ming until 1662, but the old dynasty was effectively finished. The Ming collapse was not caused by one event. It was the result of a rigid state, strained finances, global silver shocks, environmental crisis, and military failure all arriving together. If you found this helpful, please like this video and subscribe for more explainers.